pleasure to introduce Kristy Bredin to talk about the wild plants of the field, forest, and sea, medicinal plants of the San Juans. Kristy will discuss some interesting wild plants found in the San Juans and their medicinal uses. Plants may be found in the field, forest, and sea, as well as in your own garden. Kristy began her journey as an herbalist in 2009 when she began a 2-year apprenticeship with herbalist Robin Rose Bennett in New York. For the past decade, she has worked with Ryan Drum while crafting medicinal herbs and cultivating an in-depth knowledge of traditional Western herbalism and local plants and seaweeds. Since 2013, she has been sharing plant remedies of the Pacific Northwest through Mermaid Botanicals. She practices as an herbalist on Orcas Island and is passionate about exploring the natural world and working with wild plants in ancient and creative ways. And Kristy, we're going to mute and turn off those videos of our personal ones and listen to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Lena. Thanks to the Garden Club for having me this morning. And I really appreciate all the planning and organization and support for making this happen. And I'm thrilled to join everyone. Carol, are you gonna put up the slides? Great, thanks, Carol. That was a great introduction. Thanks, Lena. I'm part-time on Waldron and on Orcas, doing this medicinal plant work. And as Lena said, I've been doing it for the past decade. I'm excited to be offering my apprenticeship program again this coming spring. I offered it in 2017. It's an in-depth study of our local medicinal plants. So that's an exciting opportunity. And I offer lectures like these and classes in the region. So again, I'm very happy to be here. Let's go to the first slide, Carol. Or the second slide, I guess. Thank you. So just to introduce this lecture, I'd like to talk a bit about my perspective about engaging with plants in the natural world, what I've learned in my herbalism studies. The tradition of Western herbalism in this country is still very grassroots. It's very traditional ways of learning. We end up apprenticing with people, learning by doing. So it's definitely an interesting and diverse study, in addition to going through scientific papers and bringing those elements in. So what I have learned over the past decade, working with plants in this way, is that there's many different ways we can engage with the wild plants that are around us. And it's up to you to choose what's going to work best for you. We can engage with them just by observing them. There's a lot to learn by sitting with plants, by working with them in your garden, by harvesting it with them in the field in certain places over time. You can learn a lot from them. Drawing them is another great way to engage with them. And then, of course, there's working with them as food or medicine. But, there's when you're new to learning about harvesting wild plants, there's you need to be concerned about toxic plants in the area and that sort of thing. So, that might not be the right way for you to engage with the plants at this point in your life. So there's many options. And as one of my friends and a fellow herbalist likes to say, plants are teachers of ways of being in this world. And they teach us that by how they grow in their environment and, how we can learn from them in the ways that I mentioned. But also they teach us how to be in the world through their medicine that we can take internally. So The thought is that when you engage with an herbal remedy, you are internalizing in your body a shift in how your body is being, a shift in a condition, a shift in a circumstance, and eventually your body will learn how to adapt and change and grow with that shift that the plant has offered and do it on its own. So you work with the plant medicine for a time and then embody that wisdom. I like to also mention how we engage with the wild plants in a place where many of us may not be native peoples. There have been peoples who have lived in this region for thousands of years, and they have a very deep relationship with this land, and it's important to honor and respect that. At the same time, we live in kind of very diverse and changing, evolving times, and especially in our environment. And I think engaging with the ecosystem is a really important part of that. And we have many new people to this land who are not indigenous. We have many non-indigenous plants that grow here and have filled ecosystem niches, as we'll talk about. So there's kind of this integration process that's happening. And I like to think of it as a way of becoming indigenous again by honoring the people and cultures of where you came from, and those herbal traditions, and then honoring the traditions of the people whose land this was for a really long time. So when starting to engage with wild plants in the field, it's great to get some good field guides. 1 or 2 or 3 are often a great way to cross-reference plants, especially when you're new to identifying them, because they look very different. And, you have one picture of a plant and it could be taken at a certain time of the season, and it looks very different from what you might be seeing in the field. So multiple pictures, multiple references are helpful for clear identification. And one of our great field guides is Plants of the Pacific Northwest by Pojar and McKenna. That's really a great resource of our local native plants in the area. And then the Peterson series of field guides, they do field guides for all different parts of the United States. And in that sense, if you're interested in harvesting plants in the wild for food or medicine, it's important, like I said, to be aware of the toxic and poisonous plants in our area. There are a few that are particularly toxic and can look like other plants that might be medicinal. So it's, you want to be 200% clear about those before you engage with the plant in that way. And then it's also important to just honor the land permissions of where to harvest if you're not harvesting on your own property. And in terms of sustainability, you can learn a lot if you have your own property or a place where you harvest regularly, about how the plants grow and how to work with them in sustainable ways. That's what I do for my wild crafting work, harvesting wild herbs commercially, is I learn how the plants are growing in the environment, and I'm working with them in a sustainable way because I want to keep cultivating them for their role in the ecosystem, and so I can continue to harvest sustainably. But as a rule of thumb, you never want to harvest more than 10% of a plant population in an area if you're not familiar with the area. So those are some basic thoughts on working with wild plants. Thanks, Carol. So our first plant, the first few plants are ones that you might find in your garden. You may have planted them there, or they may have popped up from seeding from some other time or person or animal, dropping some seed there. So these may be plants that you're familiar with, but maybe you don't know much about their medicine. So yarrow is one that grows here on Waldron. It grows on most of the beaches pretty prolifically. So it tends to like sandy soil areas. But a lot of people cultivate it and have it in their gardens and fields. There are yarrows with pink and yellow flowers that are cultivated versions, ornamental versions. They may or may not have the same medicines as the white wild yarrow. One of the key things that you can use to be the judge of that is if there's a strong smell. So yarrow is a highly aromatic plant with a strong sweet smell, and that's part of its medicine is those aromatic components. So that's a way that we can tell if the yarrow we're looking at might be a similar medicine. So this is a perennial plant that's native to temperate regions of the Northern Hemisphere. It grows throughout the world. And it's been used for thousands of years by people in many different cultures. Here in the San Juans, you'll find it in flower from June to July. The leaves are dark green, feather-like, and hairy. The flowers are white to grayish white. Sometimes you see a little pink in them if there's been some crossover between those pink cultivated yarrows. And they have stalks that multiple stalks of flower heads that kind of come up and make an even flower top on them. This is one that potentially could be confused with poison hemlock, which is one of the poison ones in our area, poisonous plants, severely poisonous plant. And that's one to get to know if you're interested in wild identification, because you'd want to avoid it. And with hemlock, poison hemlock, it's got purple splotches on the stem and no hair on the stem. So that's one of the distinguishing factors, but it's important to be clear about that. Next slide, Carol. So yarrow has, I've noted some of the primary medicinal constituents. So I teach a lot of about engaging with plants through sensory awareness too, where you're tasting and smelling, and you can get a lot of information about the medicine of a plant that way, as well as knowing these constituents, because these constituents provide a certain medicine across the board. And if you know a plant has, say, a bitter component, you know that it's going to be a helpful digestive aid. So yarrow has a bitter component, which can help support healthy digestion. Bitter herbs, when taken before a meal, initiate all the gastric secretions throughout your whole gastric system. So stomach secretions, pancreatic secretions, liver and gallbladder secretions, intestinal secretions. So it really, and saliva as well. So it really primes the whole digestive system. And there's many bitter herbs that we can work with. Yarrow is just one of them. It also has a tannin content, and tannins tend to astringe tissues. So in cases where, a wound healing tannins can be helpful. They can also be helpful in cases of diarrhea or watery stools to astringe the bowels. Yarrow also has high volatile oils, and so that's the smell you're getting. And you know when a plant is highly aromatic that it's got volatile oils. Volatile oils tend to be antibacterial, and they tend the pathway of the volatile oils through the body is through the lungs and the kidneys. So part of what we think about in herbal medicine when taking it internally is how is the medicine going through the body, because we want it to be targeting where the disruption or the disease is. So highly aromatic volatile oil herbs are great as antibacterials for lung and kidney infections, because that's how they're processed through the body. Yarrow also has alkaloids, which is a range of plant chemicals that are medicinal. Its bitter component is an alkaloid, and with alkaloidal bitters, You can only use them short term. Some other herbs have other chemicals that make them bitter, and they're better for long term. But the alkaloids in yarrow can be a bit hard on the liver. So internally, yarrow is only for short term use. So some of the healing properties that I haven't mentioned yet, this comes from Chinese medicine and is kind of used in Western herbalism as well, where there's this sense of cooling, warming, drying, or moistening of tissues. And it's kind of how we think of the herbs engaging with the body, but also how we think of conditions in the body. Like you think of a hot, inflamed condition, you want to treat it with a cooling herb. And you can see that yarrow is both cooling and warming. So one of the magical things about herbs is that sometimes some of the herbs work intelligently with the body. One of the differences between an herb and a drug is that an herb taken in a more holistic form has multiple chemical components as opposed to an isolated chemical component. So often those multiple chemical components are working synergistically in the body and intelligently in the body, so that they're able to kind of move and direct the healing in sometimes very contrasting directions depending on the situation. So yarrow could be both cooling or warming depending on the situation. One of the other medicines that the volatile oils in yarrow provides is that it's anti-inflammatory. So again, cooling for inflamed conditions. It's used a lot topically as a poultice, as we'll talk about. A poultice is where you usually spit poultice is the best. You chew up the herb. In the case of yarrow, it's the leaf you would usually use, and you spit the wad onto your wound or your insect bite, where it's going to act as an anti-inflammatory and bring the inflammation down. You could also mush it up with your fingers, but in terms of wound healing, your saliva actually provides a chemical that helps support healing of wounds. We talked a bit about yarrow's antimicrobial properties. The tannins also tend to be antimicrobial. They're antibacterial and antiviral. They precipitate the protein coat on those organisms. So it's partially the tannins, partially the volatile oils in yarrow that provide that antimicrobial activity. And that's, whether you're using it topically or internally. Yarrow is also a carminative in addition to being bitter. So carminative herbs are herbs that are used later in digestion processes. So often mint family plants are used, like mint itself, or something like chamomile, if you have gas or bloating after eating. And the carminative herbs are known to help open and dilate the bile ducts and relieve gas. So yarrow kind of does both. It ends up prepping the digestive system as a bitter, but it can also act in later stages of digestion for relief from bloating. It's also an spasmodic herb, where it helps relieve cramping, particularly menstrual cramps. It's a diaphoretic. This is a very traditional fever herb. So diaphoretic herbs help induce sweating, which can be helpful to move a fever through the body. It's anti-hemorrhagic, which, as we'll learn, yarrow is truly a blood herb. It has an affinity for blood. It has components in it that are able to stop bleeding externally, and it can be used internally as well. It's an alternative means it kind of works in an intelligent way, as I've been talking about. It works on multiple conditions and holistic conditions in the body. You'll see this in several of the herbs that we talk about, and it's kind of an herbalist term for doing multiple things in the body. It's a diuretic, can help support the urinary tract, as we've talked about, and we talked about the astringency with the tannins. So I think we're ready for the next slide, Carol. So the parts used for yarrow are the leaves, the flower, and the root. You can use any or all of them. I don't use the root too much, but it can be used in cases of toothache as a fresh poultice. It helps to numb the area and to provide disinfectant properties. You can use it as a tincture, a tea, an oil, a powder, or a poultice. As in yarrow is this great wound healer. It's talked about in ancient texts such as Homer's Achilles, and it's known as soldier's woundwort in the Civil War. You see it growing on ancient battlefield sites. This is long used as a wound healer because of its ability to stop bleeding, particularly. As we think of plants as healers, we think of kind of the energy, the metaphor that they provide for us as well. Yarrow is a teacher of strength and protection. It really is a mood elevator. If you're harvesting a bunch of flowers like I do in season, you absorb a lot of the medicine through your skin and you end up feeling kind of euphoric. And it's a plant that's been traditionally used in some cultures in divination. There's the Chinese tradition of the I Ching divination where they cast sticks or some sort of, long piece of wood. And traditionally they've used yarrow stalks for that. Next slide, Carol. I think we've covered most of this already. This was a native plant here, and so peoples of the Northwest used yarrow in a lot of similar ways that we would use it today. One of its medicines that Ryan Drum, my teacher, used or was particular about using it for is at the onset of a cold or flu, taking yarrow seems to prevent the cold or flu from taking hold, but it can be used later in the cold and flu stages, like I said, to enhance sweating, to help reduce the fever, and help you move through more quickly. Like I mentioned, yarrow's a short-term use only internally, no more than 2 weeks at a time because of its being somewhat hard on the liver. And interestingly, before beer became very commercialized and mainly hops was used as an herb in beer, there are many, many medicinal plants used in brewing beer, and yarrow was one of them. Next slide, Carol. So chickweed, Stellaria media, this is a European native plant, and this is a weed you might find in your garden, which you did not plant. And it comes up pretty readily, producing a lot of seeds. It can sometimes grow under snow, but it's generally an annual that dies back and comes back. It looks like it has 10 petals, but it's actually 5 deeply cleft petals. It's a small plant growing close to the ground. And one of the distinguishing characters of it is it has this line of hair along the stem, only in one spot. It's a very juicy plant, moistening plant. And if you taste it or smell it, it's got a very grassy taste and smell. The parts used for it are the aerial parts, basically the above ground parts. Next slide, please. And this is a traditional European folk herb. So a lot of the information we get about its medicinal use is from that culture. It is a wild edible. You can put it in salads and use it that way. It's commonly used in ointments and salve formulas as a topical treatment. You could also use it as a fresh poultice like yarrow. You could juice it. I've juiced it with other herbs to use on insect bites, and that sort of thing as an anti-inflammatory and healer. Or you could use it in oil or tea. It's got a diverse set of nutrients. Yeah, that's fine, Carol, to move on. And so it's, we tend to, one of the thoughts about wild plants or over cultivated plants is they tend to have more complex nutrients and medicines and usually more intensive concentrations, because they're often in stressed conditions where they tend to produce different chemicals and absorb and use different nutrients than cultivated plants. So using chickweed as food may offer a more diverse set of nutrients to your diet. So this is another super cooling herb. It's soothing and moistening. So you would use it for hot inflammatory conditions, both internally and externally, hot and dry conditions especially. You can see there's a lot of skin conditions. It's particularly good for cystic type things. So cystic acne, actual cysts, other hard lumps and bumps, potentially other types of tumors as well. It's got saponins in it, which have dissolving properties. And my teacher, Robin Rose Bennett, has used it in a lot of cases, either as a tincture or an oil and ointment to dissolve these things over time. Ingrown hairs is another thing. The other interesting thing about it is it has drawing properties. So this and another herb we'll talk about can actually draw out things like splinters, potentially draw out toxins. Robin has a story of one of her apprentices used a bandage soaked in chickweed tincture to remove an inch-long splinter from his hand. So it's, you could use a fresh poultice, or even the tincture would work when applied consistently and just left there over time to draw those things out. It's also another antiviral and antibacterial plant. It's helpful potentially in a formula for wound healing or some infective conditions externally. Next slide, please. So plantain, Plantago lanceolata, not to be confused with the tropical plantains, the banana-like things, is another weed that you might find growing in your garden. There's two species that are around. There's the lanceolata. There's also Plantago major, which is the broadleaf plantain, has bigger, wider leaves, and both are medicinal. There's some debate as to which is more medicinal or what it's medicinal for. Ryan Drum was always insistent that Plantago lanceolata had more medicine than the major, but you could use both in the ways that I'll talk about. So different species of plantain grow throughout the world. This is another highly regarded plant by many different cultures that use this plant where it grows. It's strongly veined. The lance leaf plantain, as pictured here, has narrow leaves and a basal rosette, and it grows up to about 4 inches tall. It grows year round here. Tends to grow in hard compacted soil, which tells us it's got this ability to pull nutrients from the soil. Next slide. The parts used for medicine on plantain are the leaves, the seeds, and sometimes the root. I haven't really worked with the root myself, but there's some information about working with it. I've mainly worked with the leaves, and you could use it as a poultice. This is another really powerful wound healing and skin healing herb. It's got a constituent in it called allantoin that's only really available in the fresh plant that helps to stimulate and tissue growth, new tissue growth. So it's most often used as a poultice, a fresh poultice, but you can use it as a tea internally, or a juice externally or internally, powder externally or internally. Generally, if you're going to use it internally, you would probably try to use a more concentrated form, like a decoction, which is a tea that's kind of slow cooked over a period of time, or a tincture. But yeah, this is a go-to herbalist favorite for healing wounds and all sorts of skin irritations. I use this as part of a protocol, probably refer back to when we talk about the next plant. I saw it into my thumb a couple of years ago harvesting willow bark, and it was pretty deep. It probably could have used stitches, but part of my protocol was using fresh plantain, which, like yarrow, contains tannins, and so that helped to sterilize the wound and to initiate the healing process. And that wound healed really nicely. I also used plantain in a powder with some other anti-infective herbs, and as part of that healing protocol. That was really effective. As I said, it's astringent. It contains tannins, so it tightens and tones tissue internally or externally. It does have antibacterial properties. It's demulcent, so it has some moistening properties as well with the allantoin that I mentioned. It's another anti-inflammatory herb. Helps to relieve pain and reduce swelling or bruising. And like chickweed, this is another well-known herb for drawing out poisons and splinters. There's a story from herbalist Matt Wood about an Anishinaabe healer, Kiwe Dinokwe, who saved a woman's life from a black widow spider bite by using a plantain poultice to draw out the toxins from the spider. 2 of her friends died within 24 hours. So, really a powerful drawing medicine. There's another herbalist in the Northeast, David Winston, who tells a story of going on a plant walk out in the field with a bee sting. So I got stung on the tongue by a beamer EpiPen, and they used the plantain poultice in an emergency. And by the time she got back to the cars, she was more or less fine. She didn't have the impending allergic reaction that was expected because of the plantain. This is also, it's a cooling herb for dry and hot tissues, and it's particularly good for poison ivy, poison oak rashes. I've had poison ivy several times as a budding herbalist in the Northeast, and it's really a tough condition to work with. I tried all the herbal tricks in the book, and this fresh plantain poultice was what worked best because it's a hot and dry condition, but it's also kind of oozing and wet, and a lot of the remedies out there dry it out too much, but plantain kind of provides the right balance to work with it. And I've worked with some cases of poison oak rash where it's been really helpful.
Kristy, we have a question. Is this the same
Okay.
as English plantain?
It could be. I'm not sure. I mean, it's a pretty pervasive plant in several different parts of the world, but I'd have to know the species to know for sure.
Ryan, if you know it, just pop it in chat. This person's allergic to English plantain.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, that's interesting. Yeah, I wonder if it is the same plant. Okay, I'm ready for the next slide. I'll just mention briefly, because I want to make sure we get to some of these other plants, that you may know of a supplement called Psyllium Husk, and that's based on another, is usually from another species of plantain. But you can use the seeds of the local plantain as well as this bulking agent for a bulking laxative for stools. So the seeds are highly fibrous and they're used in that way. And by adding this fibrous material to your diet, it can help with high cholesterol as well as high blood sugar issues by helping to slow down the digestive process. Let's go to the next slide. So calendula, this is one that you may grow in your garden, and it may come up as a volunteer if someone else planted it, or if you planted it, it grows pretty well here. It's an annual, it's native to Europe and cultivated in many places. It has bright yellow flowers, and you'll notice on the flowers and the leaves, it's got this sticky resin, which is part of its medicine and one of the ways to easily identify it. The parts you use for medicine are the above ground aerial parts. The flowers are most typically what's used as medicine, often just the petals and not the inner part. But you can use the whole plant in preparations to get that resinous medicine. And it's used as a poultice, an oil, a tea, tincture, powder, or juice, both internally or externally. Next slide, please. So calendula is another favorite of herbalists. It's adored as the mother of the skin. It's a gentle yet powerful healer. It's often used in as a topical in different baby formulas like baby powder or salve for children or diaper rash. Like plantain, it has substances in it that promote epithelialization or the knitting together of skin tissues. So it's great to speed up the healing process for wounds. And this is another one. I've made some pretty potent compound calendula lotion preparations using different extraction methods for the whole plant. And I use this lotion in the final stages of healing of my my saw wound, and it really helped to knit the skin together and to heal the injury really well. It's also antiviral, antifungal, and antibacterial, so it can help in the wound healing process in that way to keep wounds from getting infected. As an antifungal, I mean, many herbs are antifungal, and fungal conditions tend to be really tenacious, so it might work, but you'd have to apply it pretty rigorously to a condition like that. It's also anti-inflammatory, antispasmodic, helps with muscle spasms in the body. It's a cholagogue, which means that it's a liver supportive herb and liver stimulant. It's a diaphoretic like yarrow, induces sweating. And this is a traditional lymphatic herb. It can stimulate lymph movement in the body, which is often some people have trouble with lymphatic movement. It's stimulated by your movement in general, and so sometimes these herbs can help to move lymph through the system, especially in breast and pelvic tissues. So it can be helpful with people who may have enlarged lymph nodes. One of the other things about calendula, it is that bright orange color. It has nourishing carotenoids, so that's part of its ability to help promote skin healing. And potentially like a compound calendula lotion that I've worked with can be helpful for viral conditions, such as a topical for virals, such as warts. This is an edible plant. A lot of people put the flowers in salads, but they're a little tough to eat. So, some people don't like how they feel in the mouth, and you wouldn't want to eat too much of them, but they can be eaten. And just like this plant heals skin conditions externally, it can be used internally as a powder to help heal tissues, like in cases of leaky gut. Next slide, please. This is one of our most infamous weeds, dandelion. Most of you probably know this plant and have probably seen it in your garden. You may have tried to remove it or not. But this is another really powerful herb that many herbalists love to work with. The Latin name Taraxicum Officiale comes from the origins meaning to remedy or heal a disturbance or disorder. So it's native to Eurasia, but was introduced to North America, and it now grows in nearly a lot of temperate regions of the world. The flowers open and close with the sun and with nighttime darkness. So that's really a neat phenomenon to watch. Like I said, most of you probably know this plant, but the leaves form a basal rosette. They're deeply toothed. The flowers, yellow composite family flower. The petals are edible. They're pretty sweet if you peel away the external green part, and then the leaves are edible too, but they're quite bitter, and the root's edible as well, but that's quite bitter too. Next slide, please. As I said, every part of the plant is edible. It's also every part of the plant is used as medicine in different ways. You can use it fresh or dried. The fresh root has, the root in general has liver supportive properties. Ryan Drum is very specific about the fresh root being used only in the fresh form for liver healing properties. And then the leaves are used as an edible or as a medicine. They're more effective for the kidneys as a diuretic. And then the root is known as a liver tonic medicine, partially because it's bitter. And people harvest it at different times. Generally, they harvest it in the spring and fall, because when you're harvesting the root of a plant, or any part of the plant, you want to be harvesting it at the time where it's putting that energy into the plant. So in the spring, late spring and summer, dandelion's putting its energy into the leaves and flowers. So you want it in the fall or in the spring when the energy is still very much down in the roots. And so many herbalists might harvest it in the spring. It has more of a bitter component in the spring, whereas in the fall, it has a more nutrient dense component because it's starting to store all its sugars and nutrients to make it through the winter. It's both cooling and drying, so hot, wet conditions in the body. It can act as a laxative by stimulating the liver and stimulating digestion. This is another alternative where it works on whole systems of the body. And it's particularly known for its blood and lymph cleansing ability. So by working through the liver and the digestive tract, it ends up clearing a lot of fluids in the body. Next slide. So part of the metaphor we think of when healing with dandelion, or kind of the energy of this plant, is that it's a plant that teaches us about strength and courage and stamina. You see this plant in cities growing in concrete. It's such a tenacious plant that it can penetrate asphalt. And it can be a very uplifting plant, especially when working with the flower medicine. We think of the metaphor of the flowers closing at night or when it's cloudy. So it kind of speaks to people who tend to close up and need more opening in the sun. There's a great tradition of making dandelion wine, which I've tried a few times. It's best to pick the petals out from the green area to remove some of that bitterness, but you get this beautifully golden sparkling essence wine. That's really lovely. Next slide. So self-heal Pernilla vulgaris. This is a mint family plant that you might find in your gardens. It kind of grows around all kinds of places. I think it's, spread by different animals, especially if you lived in areas where there's been grazing animals. It's a native to Europe, Asia, Africa, and North America, and grows throughout temperate regions. And with all mint family plants are pretty easy to identify, and they have a lot of similar medicines. Generally, they're non-toxic. So like other mint family plants, this has a square stalk with opposite alternating leaves. And it grows very low to the ground. And if you haven't noticed this plant before, you'll be struck when it's in flower by these beautiful, deep, rich purple, what they call doll's eyes. Sometimes they call this plant doll's eyes because the flowers before they open, as you can see in that picture, have this really rich, vibrant purple color. And you'll see it in bloom from June through August. There's the name self-heal, but it's also known as hook heal, all heal, and carpenter's herb. So again, this is a traditionally revered herb for as a powerful healer in many different conditions. Next slide. So this can be used both internally and externally. There's the old French proverb, no one wants a surgeon who keeps Pernilla. So it's another wound healer, a styptic, which means that it stops bleeding like Yarrow does. So you can use it as a juice, as a poultice or salve externally. It's great as a juice or poultice for insect bites, reducing the inflammation and itching. Internally, you can take it as a tea tincture. I haven't eaten it, but it's known to be an edible plant. It's also antiseptic and antiviral. So there's been some interesting studies that show its ability to hinder some viruses from replication, like the cold sore virus. It's also shown anti-HIV activity. So, it's got powerful potential there. As a tea or tincture, it can help with throat infection, flu, or fever. It's also highly antioxidant. It contains a component called rosmarinic acid, which is also in rosemary, and an antioxidant in rosemary, and it's actually got more rosmarinic acid than rosemary does. So mint family plants can also generally, like this one, can generally be helpful for upset stomach. And because of the antiseptic qualities, it's traditionally used as a gargle for mouth inflammations, bleeding gums, sores, or gum disease. Next slide. California poppy is one that you would come across locally, might be in your garden. This is an annual or perennial where it's warm enough for them to live year round. It's native to the Pacific slope of North America, so from Western Oregon to Baja California. Reaches up to 60 centimeters in height and has this blue-green foliage that is really distinctive. It's usually got one solitary flower that's orange to red with 4 petals that are really silky. And the parts that are used for medicine are the whole plant, mainly the aerial parts when it's in flower. Next slide. This is an interesting one because it's quite chemically complex. It's rich in medicinal alkaloids, and some of those alkaloids in isolation are thought to be toxic, but traditionally herbalists have noted that when they're used in combination, it's a safe and effective remedy even for children. The alkaloids in California poppy make it a medicinal nervine, so they have a calming, soothing, sedative effect. It can also be used for mood support, but it's contraindicated in some cases of depression. More specifically, it's good for people who have sensitivity to weather changes or dealing with long-term mental or physical tiredness. It's got antispasmodic properties on muscle spasms, but also particularly for spasmodic coughs. So it has antitussive properties where it relieves coughs, and it's also sedative, so it's great for excessive coughing conditions like something like whooping cough. It's an analgesic in that it numbs pain. It's a topical antifungal and antimicrobial for obstinate infections. So this is kind of a less known use of it, but you can use the tincture on different infections externally. And I've used it on a rash I had that was pretty obstinate. I didn't know what was happening with it or what it was from, but it's very itchy. And it was California poppy tincture was the only thing that relieved it and started the healing process. Generally, this plant is harvested in the spring. There's some cyanide-like compounds in this plant that are in some medicinal plants, and those are higher in the early spring or in the reproductive structures. So those are less desirable times to harvest this plant if working with it internally. You want to harvest it at the height of the season while in flower. And some people just make a medicine with the aerial parts. Some people use the root as well. I haven't eaten the leaves, but they're supposedly edible. And those bright orange flowers like calendula contain carotenoids and bioflavonoids, specifically rutin, which is known to strengthen the capillaries and reduce bruising. Next slide. So I know we're getting close to time, and we're about to talk about my favorite plants. So I will talk about them lovingly and briefly. But these are a couple interesting ones that we find in the forest. So coral root orchid is a saprophytic orchid, which means it lacks chlorophyll. And there's a few of these plants. We'll talk about another one next. And what's interesting about them is because they don't produce chlorophyll to make their own food, they've developed this relationship with the fungi that live in the forest floor and feed off the forest stuff. And they've negotiated this relationship where the fungi feeds them. And a lot of people look at this as potentially a parasitic relationship, but it's thought that there's actually that the coral root is sharing something with the fungi as well. These are really interesting plants too, in that they're so delicate. They have these tiny seeds, and they're dependent on very specific fungi to develop this feeding relationship. And so you see them growing a lot on old trails or old roads, or even with roads around here on Waldron, which are used kind of gently. I think they tend to thrive in places where the soil is lightly disturbed, because I think the disturbance helps to connect the mycelium with the seeds. Next slide. So you can see where coral root gets its name from that picture I have there, the roots of this plant. They're very coral-like. They fit kind of like puzzle pieces together. And generally the whole plant is tinctured. There's some traditional uses of the dried root as a cold infused tea. And this is a really great nervine, used for both adults and children. Children are too wound up to go to sleep, tired, stressed out people. I find it a particularly good remedy for PMS or in other situations, but I found this particularly for someone in that feeling where everything feels like it's going wrong and gonna fall apart and you just want to cry. It's a really soothing remedy for moments like those, and helps you to move through them. This has also been traditionally used in fevers and respiratory conditions, especially at the end of a cold or flu. And I look to this plant as a teacher of orchid-like people, delicate people, of how to be sensitive and graceful while being in a prominent place as these very delicate plants kind of grow in these trails and places where there's some traffic. Next slide. So for the sake of time, I won't read this lovely poem, but check it out. Barbara Kingsolver recently came out with this Ghost Pipes poem that speaks really beautifully about the essence of this plant that she experienced, engaging with it in the forest. Next slide. So this is another saprophytic plant, and we'll get into its mycelial relationship, which is really interesting, slightly different than coral root. But just to show you these pictures here, so that's Ryan Drum's hand in there to give you a scale of these plants. You probably have come across them in the forest walk around and you're like, whoa, what is this plant? A lot of people get them confused with mushrooms, but again, it's a non-chlorophyll producing plant, and it actually can come in many different colors. You can see that pink shaded one. There's some that end up being dark purple, and I find that they're colored by the trees that they grow amongst. So you'll find the pink ones growing in kind of mainly cedar areas, and the purple and white ones in more fir or diverse areas. And you can kind of see the roots pictured. They're kind of like these very small, brain-like, densely packed root balls. And these ghost pipes are found in healthy boreal forests throughout the Northern Hemisphere. They can grow in centuries for one place. They kind of grow like coral root in these slightly disturbed areas. But the really fascinating thing about their relationship to the mycelium is that, like coral root, they're using the mycelial network to feed, but what they do instead is they mimic tree roots. So they're convincing the mycelium that are connected to all these trees in the ecosystem. And there's a lot of great new information coming out about mycelial networks and how they work in the forest. And so they're connecting all these trees, and they feed the tree. Nutrients are passed among the trees as well as information. And the ghost pipe is kind of in the middle of this vast network of information and nutrients. And it's getting its nutrients from the mycelium by pretending to essentially be a tree, which is really neat. And so this is a great metaphor for what this plant medicine does, is that it helps us to deal with overwhelming experience, because it has this capacity to hold its ground amidst vast amounts of information being passed in the mycelial network. So this is a really neat medicine for physical pain, emotional pain, and overwhelming experiences, even for overwhelming experiences. And, there's plants that we can use that numb experiences, and they numb pain in the body. But as herbalists, we like to think of pain as information and things that we need to work with and work through. So what Ghost Pipe does is it helps us to kind of get to a safe, grounded mental space to process that overwhelming experience. So it's a really great trauma herb. And I think it's a really great medicine for our time, because it helps us to process a lot of intense experiences that seem to be happening these days. Next slide, and I realize we're running pretty late at this point, so I can just mention a bit about seaweeds in general, and if we feel we want to go a little longer, I can talk about a couple of seaweeds that I put in here. If not, I'm happy to stop here, but just to say that seaweeds are fascinating plants from our ocean, and we're lucky to live in a place near the ocean where we have these plants that are very different from land plants. They absorb nutrients from the water. They have these holdfasts that hold them close to shore so they can get a lot of the nutrients that are coming offshore. And sea plants are great food for us because they get a lot of nutrient diversity that we don't necessarily get from land plants, mainly iodine, which they have a biological need for, but land plants don't. They also have these unique compounds called phycopolymers, or the gels that keep them hydrated, and those have great medicinal properties and are highly antiviral. They've been well studied as an antiviral. And seaweeds are teachers of strength and flexibility. They live in a place where they need to be strong, they need to hold down to where they are, but they also need to be flexible and flow in the water. And a lot of people use seaweeds on their garden beds here where they have access to beach harvesting. You need to be aware of the harvesting regulations, but you can harvest seaweeds to eat yourself or supplement as a garden fertilizer. So I'll stop there. I think that's going to be good. Does anyone have any questions?
No questions so far.
Yeah, though we went through a lot of material in a short amount of time, so I appreciate everyone listening and hanging in there.
And can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. It doesn't show on my screen, so I just wanted to be sure. But Kristy, I keep thinking about third time is lucky, because we had tried to have you, the people who were developing the program before me had arranged for you to talk, and then you hadn't been able to because of the snowstorm, and then because of COVID, and now finally here you are, and I'm so glad. Obviously a lot of information, but also it makes me think that I will look differently at all the plants that I see around me here on my property, which I love that was really tied in with those things.
Great.
Pardon me?
Great.
Yeah. The other thing that I'll take with me is that phrase becoming indigenous again. That, especially as a multiple time immigrant to various places, or that really resonated with me. So thank you very much for this. What we're going to do now is that Dixie's going to just give us a short presentation, and then Nita, and then there's going to be a slideshow for those of you who would like to see pictures of gardens, an annotated slideshow, which we end with that. There won't be anything after that. Thank you so much for joining us, Kristy, and for your presentation.
Sure. And just to say, I see there's some questions coming up in the chat, but seems like we might need to move on. So people can feel free to email me your questions. I'm happy to get back to you. My website website is mermaid-botanicals.com. You can email me that way. Maybe I'll put that up in the chat.
I think that's a great idea. And also, I would remind people to look at our last newsletter, because there's a really in-depth article about some things that Kristy has talked about today. And she has there's a link to another article that she's written. And so more resources there, but I'm not sure if there are ways to contact you there. So if you want to put that in the chat, that's probably helpful.
Mm-hmm.
All righty, so in closing, I just like to offer up another very sincere thank you to Kristy, of course, to the Orcas Island Club leaders, to all of our Lopez Island Club members who joined us today. I was keeping an eye out on the number of people who joined us, not the ones that we're going to see it later, but I believe we were up to 48 members joining us today, which is, it's great. So I'm going to bid adieu right now and let Nita come and close the meeting. And then I look forward to our Gardens of Lopez, narrated by Tom Bowden. Bye, all.
Thank you, Kristy, for a wonderful program. Thank you, Lopez and Orcas Island Garden Club members who've joined us today. Special thanks to the library for their wonderful hosting of our programs. And I just want to remind you that our November program will be on November 10th. Our guest presenter will be Jessie Bloom, and she will be talking about permaculture and resiliency. So I hope you'll join us then. And now, as we close our meeting, Tom Bowden is going to share a few slides from the Lopez Garden Club. Thank you all for coming today.
Thank you, Nita. Hopefully everybody can hear me. I'm going to share my screen now and start this PowerPoint presentation. I have about a dozen slides that we collected from members both this year and last year. So it's a combination of fall, mostly fall colors and fall themes. So we'll start. The first one is Water Beads on Kale by member Tracy Cottingham from Lopez. And here are some pears on Dixie's tree, ready for harvest. Good fall colors. The euonymus at the Lopez School is doing marvelously this year. And here are some pumpkins, this is that time of the month, that time of the year, along with some witch hazel. And this is our Katsura, which was in full glory last week. It has already started to lose most of its leaves, but it's a spectacular plant. And it smells good. It smells like pumpkin? Cotton candy. More fall colors from Tracy. And again, another one from Tracy, a nice, I think, sunset in this case, but I'm not sure. And here's a couple of hummingbirds on Dixie's feeder at sunset. A nice ash in full yellow at Wendy's property. Dixie's Japanese maple. And finally, not a Lopez shot, but Lorraine and I were up at Harts Pass about a week and a half ago, and the larches there were stunning. There you go.
Great, thank you, Tom, and thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you all next month. Bye-bye.